Mark Reynolds and Emily Henderson were the kind of neighbors who seemed destined to clash, one obsessed with order, the other driven by chaos, and their quiet suburban feud over a simple wooden fence would soon spiral into a mystery that left an entire neighborhood haunted by what lay buried beneath the soil. Maplewood Lane was the kind of neighborhood that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Rows of neat houses lined the street, each with a manicured lawn, colorful flowers, and smiling residents who waved as they walked their dogs or watered their gardens. For years, the small community enjoyed a peaceful rhythm. Neighbors shared holiday dinners, exchanged gifts at Christmas, and organized block parties every summer. It was the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. Until the day Mark Reynolds moved in. Mark arrived on a quiet spring afternoon, driving a spotless silver truck packed with boxes labeled tools, garage, and office. He didn't say much to anyone at first. He nodded politely to those who greeted him but never joined conversations or accepted invitations. People assumed he was shy, maybe a little reserved but harmless. Over the next few weeks, his habits began to stand out. Mark mowed his lawn every 2 days, trimmed his hedges with a ruler for precision, and swept his driveway twice daily to remove even the smallest leaf. His obsession with neatness was impressive at first, then a little strange. Next door to Mark lived the Henderson family, a young couple, Emily and Tom, with 2 energetic children and a golden retriever named Buddy. Their home was the opposite of Mark's perfectly structured property. Toys were often scattered in the yard, the kids' laughter filled the air, and Buddy ran freely, digging holes and chasing squirrels. The Hendersons weren't messy, but they lived with a kind of joyful chaos that made their house feel alive. For a while, the 2 households coexisted peacefully. The Hendersons appreciated having a quiet neighbor, and Mark seemed content keeping to himself. But underneath that calm surface, small irritations began to grow. Mark disliked how Buddy barked early in the mornings. He disliked how the children's ball sometimes rolled into his yard. He disliked how their fence, an old wooden barrier separating the 2 properties, leaned slightly toward his side. One morning, Mark stood by the fence with a tape measure in his hand. He examined the posts closely, muttering as he noted the angle of the wood. The next day, he left a neatly written note in the Hendersons' mailbox, suggesting they repair the fence before it caused problems. The Hendersons laughed it off, thinking it was an overreaction. They thanked him and promised to get to it when they had time. But for Mark, that wasn't enough. He started spending long hours in his backyard, studying the fence as if it were an unsolved mystery. Neighbors walking by noticed him pacing, stopping every few feet to jot down notes in a small notebook. At night, his porch light stayed on until late, illuminating the fence line like a crime scene. The Hendersons tried to ignore it, assuming it was just another one of his quirks. Then subtle changes appeared. A section of the fence had been freshly painted only on Mark's side. A few days later, one of the posts looked like it had been moved slightly. The Hendersons dismissed it as weather damage, but others began to notice Mark's growing fixation. What began as a harmless concern about property boundaries slowly started to feel like the beginning of something much darker. It started with what seemed like a simple misunderstanding. Mark believed the fence was leaning more onto his property every day. To him, it was a matter of respect and order. He had built his life on rules and measurements, and the idea that someone's carelessness might invade his perfectly drawn boundaries made him restless. The Hendersons, on the other hand, saw it differently. They thought Mark was overreacting to something trivial, something that barely mattered in the grand scheme of things. But soon, that difference in perspective began to rot the harmony that once existed between their homes. One Saturday morning, Mark walked outside holding a folder filled with photographs. He had taken them over several weeks, documenting what he believed was the fence's gradual shift toward his yard. Each photo had dates and measurements written carefully on the back. He sent copies to the Homeowners Association, hoping they would take his side. When no action followed, he called the city's zoning department and requested a property inspection. When the inspector arrived, The entire street seemed to watch. Neighbors peeked through curtains as the man in the yellow vest stretched his measuring tape from post to post, jotting down figures in a small notebook. Mark stood rigid, hands clasped behind his back, while Emily Henderson waited nearby, trying to stay calm. The result was not what Mark expected. The inspector declared that the fence sat fully on the Hendersons' property line, meaning Mark had no claim to it. He accepted the verdict in silence, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. That evening, lights flickered inside Mark's house long past midnight. The next morning, the fence on his side had been repainted a darker shade of brown. The color bled slightly through the cracks, staining the Hendersons' side unevenly. It wasn't enough to complain about officially, but enough to send a message. From that point on, the neighborhood's perfect calm began to fracture. The Hendersons' sprinklers, once harmlessly watering their grass, somehow began spraying over the property line, soaking Mark's freshly cut lawn. A few days later, a small pile of leaves appeared near his shed, though no trees stood nearby. When Mark noticed his garden shears missing, he accused the Henderson kids in a note he left under their doormat. The note was signed neatly, but its words carried quiet anger. Rumors started to spread. At first, people took sides lightly, treating it as petty neighbor drama. But over time, the tension grew harder to ignore. The Hendersons began locking their gate, while Mark installed new security cameras pointed directly at the fence. The once friendly hellos turned into awkward silence. Even Buddy, the dog, seemed to sense the unease, barking at Mark's yard more than ever. Each passing day deepened the divide. The two families lived beside each other, but it felt like a cold war. There were no direct confrontations, yet every action seemed calculated, every gesture laced with hidden meaning. It was as if the fence had transformed into a battle line drawn in wood and paint, separating not just two properties, but two worlds that could no longer exist peacefully side by side. By the time summer ended, the quiet tension between Mark and the Hendersons had turned into a heavy presence that everyone on Maplewood Lane could feel. Neighbors stopped hosting gatherings, no one lingered outside in the evenings, and the once lively street grew silent. People whispered about strange noises coming from Mark's yard at night, low scraping sounds and the occasional thud that broke through the stillness. Some said they saw him digging near the fence under the light of a flashlight, though no one dared to confront him. One night, around midnight, several security cameras in the area captured movement along the fence line. A single figure dressed in dark clothes walked slowly, stopping at each post as though inspecting them one by one. The next morning, Mark stood outside his house, holding a broken piece of wood in his hand. He claimed someone had vandalized his fence, snapping one of the boards in half. He called the police and filed a report, insisting that he was being targeted. When officers arrived, they found no fingerprints, no footprints, and no sign of forced entry. It was as if the damage had appeared out of nowhere. The Hendersons insisted they had nothing to do with it. They said they had been asleep, unaware of anything unusual. Still, Mark began acting more paranoid. He posted messages on the neighborhood forum warning everyone to watch their property and keep an eye on suspicious behavior. The posts made some neighbors uneasy, while others found them bizarrely detailed. He listed exact times when he heard sounds, described shadows he had seen, and even attached blurry photos of the fence under flashlight. A few days later, the Hendersons installed a new security camera facing the shared fence. They thought it would finally bring clarity, either proving Mark wrong or showing who was causing the disturbances. For a while, nothing happened. Then, one night, the camera captured something unexpected. Just after midnight, the footage showed Mark himself in his backyard, kneeling by the fence. He appeared to be digging near the base of one of the posts. His flashlight moved in slow, deliberate circles, and he seemed to be burying something small before patting the soil flat again. When the Hendersons saw the footage, they felt a wave of unease. They brought the video to the police, but Mark had an explanation ready. He said he was fixing a drainage issue caused by rainwater pooling near the fence. Without any clear evidence of wrongdoing, there was nothing authorities could do. They warned both parties to keep their distance and avoid further confrontation. After that night, the relationship between the two houses became even colder. Mark stopped acknowledging anyone on the street. He rarely left his home during the day, but neighbors reported seeing lights flickering through his windows late at night. The Hendersons, too, changed their routines, no longer letting their children play outside unsupervised. The cheerful sounds of laughter that once filled the air were replaced by silence. The fence stood between them like a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, and behind it, something far more disturbing seemed to be growing in the shadows. Autumn arrived quietly, bringing cool air and shorter days, but the uneasy atmosphere on Maplewood Lane lingered. The neighborhood no longer felt friendly or safe. The Hendersons tried to move on, hoping the tension with Mark would fade, yet a constant feeling of being watched followed them. Sometimes, when Emily looked out her kitchen window, she could see Mark standing in his yard, perfectly still, staring at the fence as though it held some terrible secret. He never said anything, never made a move, just watched until she drew the curtains closed. Then came the morning that shattered whatever normalcy was left. It was early October, and the Hendersons' children ran into the backyard to feed Buddy, their golden retriever. Within seconds, their laughter turned into screams. Emily rushed outside and found Buddy lying motionless near the fence, his food untouched. The air was still, heavy with dread. The family rushed the dog to the vet, but it was too late. The vet confirmed that Buddy had been poisoned, most likely by something laced with chemicals hidden in the soil. The news spread fast. Everyone on Maplewood Lane began whispering again. Many suspected Mark immediately, though no one dared to say it aloud. The police were called to investigate, and once again, Mark stood at the center of suspicion. He denied everything, insisting that someone was trying to frame him. He looked tired, pale, and anxious, yet his words carried the same precision and control as always. Officers examined the fence area, searching for clues, and it didn't take long before they found something unusual. Buried just beneath the soil on Mark's side of the property was a small plastic container. Inside it were pellets mixed with a toxic substance, strong enough to kill an animal within hours. When confronted, Mark claimed he had used the pellets for pest control, unaware that they had somehow spread to the other side. His explanation didn't convince anyone, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. He returned to his house in silence while the Hendersons locked their doors and closed their blinds. After that, Mark's behavior changed. He stopped mowing his lawn, stopped collecting his mail, and stopped turning on the lights inside his home. Days passed without anyone seeing him. The curtains stayed drawn, and his once perfect yard began to wither. Some neighbors said they heard strange noises at night coming from his property, metal scraping, soft thuds, and what sounded like quiet murmuring. No one wanted to check. Then, one evening, Mark's truck was found parked 2 streets away, the driver's door open, keys still dangling in the ignition. There was no sign of him. Police searched his house and found it eerily neat, everything in its place except for one detail. The notebook he always carried was missing. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no trace of him. Then, a hiker in the nearby woods stumbled upon a single work glove half buried under fallen leaves. The fabric was smeared with brown paint that matched the color of Mark's fence. Investigators took it as evidence, but no further clues emerged. The street returned to silence once more, though everyone who lived there knew the quiet meant something far worse than peace. Months passed before anyone spoke openly about what had happened on Maplewood Lane. Mark Reynolds remained missing, and his house stood empty, its windows dark and its yard slowly overtaken by weeds. The city eventually posted a notice on the front door declaring the property abandoned. For a while it stayed that way, a silent reminder of the strange events that had divided the neighborhood. Most people avoided walking past it. Some said they could still hear noises from the backyard late at night, faint scraping sounds, as if someone were still there, working under the soil. When spring arrived again, the house was finally sold. A young couple, eager to start fresh, bought it at a surprisingly low price. They knew the stories, of course, but brushed them off as neighborhood gossip. They wanted to believe the past was gone. Within weeks of moving in, they began renovations, tearing out the overgrown shrubs and replacing the crumbling patio. For a while, it seemed like the property might finally return to normal. Then, one afternoon, a worker digging near the old fence uncovered something unusual. At first, it looked like a rotted piece of wood, but as he brushed away the dirt, he noticed it wasn't part of the fence at all. It was buried deeper, covered in layers of soil and debris. When he called his supervisor over, they decided to stop digging and contact the police. Within hours, the area was sealed off with yellow tape. What investigators found beneath the ground shocked everyone. There was a shallow pit filled with decaying wood fragments, nails, and torn pieces of fabric. Mixed among them were traces of dried blood. Forensics determined the blood did not belong to Mark Reynolds, but to another man who had gone missing 3 years earlier, a local handyman who had once done repair work on Maplewood Lane. The discovery reopened the case, forcing detectives to look at everything with new eyes. As the investigation deepened, a disturbing theory emerged. It appeared that Mark, while digging near the fence months before his disappearance, had accidentally unearthed evidence of the handyman's death. Fearing he would be blamed, he had likely reburied it and told no one. His behavior afterward, his paranoia, the sleepless nights, the obsessive watching of the fence, suddenly made sense. It was possible that the truth had terrified him, that his silence had trapped him in a situation he couldn't escape. Still, one question remained. What had happened to Mark? Search teams combed the nearby woods, drained ponds, and interviewed every resident on Maplewood Lane, but no sign of him ever surfaced. Some believed he had fled town to escape the guilt or fear. Others whispered darker theories, that he had met the same fate as the man buried near his fence. The new owners of the house moved out after only 3 months. They said they couldn't sleep, that motion lights kept turning on by themselves at night near the same section of fence. No one has lived there since. On quiet evenings when the wind blows through Maplewood Lane, neighbors say the wooden boards still creak faintly, as if someone on the other side is pressing a hand against them, trying to come back home.